The rain stung Ethan's face like 1,000 tiny needles. But he didn't flinch. Not even as the hunter's shadow loomed closer through the fog-choked alley. His heart pounded. A wild drumbeat screaming run. Yet his feet stayed rooted, tethered by the desperate plan forming in his mind. Seduction was his only weapon now. A dangerous game to outwit the man who'd been tracking him for weeks, a man who never failed to catch his prey. Ethan Kane was no stranger to survival. At 25, he'd clawed his way through foster homes, street fights, and a world that seemed hell-bent on breaking him. His hazel eyes, sharp and soulful, had always been his greatest asset, disarming strangers and lovers alike. But tonight, in the underbelly of Seattle, those eyes were fixed on Caleb Stone, the hunter who'd been hired to drag him back to a past he'd fought to escape. Caleb, 27, was a legend in the city's Shadowsa, former soldier turned mercenary, with a reputation for ruthlessness and a face that could stop hearts. Ethan had seen him once before, in a crowded bar, all sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Now, those eyes were hunting him. Ethan's breath hitched as he pressed himself against the cold brick wall, the damp seeping through his thin jacket. He'd been running for months, ever since he'd stolen evidence that could bring down Vincent Marrow, a tech mogul whose empire was built on lies and blood. Ethan hadn't meant to get tangled in Marrow's web. He'd just been a low-level coder, scraping by, when he stumbled across files proving Marrow's company was funding illegal experiments. He'd taken the data and run, knowing it was his only leverage. But Marrow didn't let loose ends dangle. He'd sent Caleb, the best, to hunt Ethan down. The alley was a dead end, and Ethan knew it. His plan was reckless, born of desperation. Caleb was straight, or so the rumors went. But Ethan had learned long ago that desire could be a weapon, a way to bend even the strongest wills. If he could get close enough, charm his way into Caleb's trust, maybe, just maybe, he could buy enough time to slip away. He adjusted his stance, letting his jacket fall open to reveal the curve of his collarbone. A calculated move to draw Caleb's eye. Footsteps echoed, deliberate and heavy. Caleb emerged from the fog, his silhouette cutting through the dim streetlight. He was taller than Ethan remembered, his broad shoulders filling the narrow alley. His hoodie was soaked, clinging to his frame, and his blue eyes locked onto Ethan with an intensity that made his stomach twist. "You're out of places to run, Kane," Caleb said, his voice low, gravelly, like he'd smoked one too many cigarettes. He stepped closer, and Ethan caught the faint scent of cedar and gunpowder. Ethan forced a smile, slow and deliberate, letting his gaze linger on Caleb's lips. "Who says I'm running?" he replied, his voice softer than the rain, laced with a challenge. He stepped forward, closing the distance, his heart racing as he gambled everything on this moment. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't move back. Ethan's pulse surged. "It's working." He leaned in, just enough to let his breath brush Caleb's ear, whispering, "Maybe I wanted you to catch me." For a moment, the world stilled. Caleb's eyes flickered, a crack in his armor, and Ethan seized it. He reached out, his fingers grazing Caleb's arm, testing the waters. The hunter didn't pull away, but his gaze darkened, a storm brewing behind those blue eyes. "Don't play games with me," Caleb warned, his voice rougher now. But there was something else there, something unsteady. Ethan's smile widened, though his insides churned. This was no game. This was survival. But as he looked into Caleb's eyes, he felt a spark he hadn't expected. A pull that made his carefully laid plans waver. The rain fell harder, blurring the lines between predator and prey. Ethan didn't know if he was seducing Caleb or himself. But one thing was clear. This dance was only beginning. And it was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The next hour was a blur of calculated moves and stolen glances. Ethan led Caleb to a dive bar nearby, claiming he needed a drink to talk things out. The bar was a haze of neon and cigarette smoke, the kind of place where secrets were traded as easily as cash. Ethan sat across from Caleb at a sticky table, nursing a whiskey he barely touched. He leaned forward, letting his knee brush Caleb's under the table. A subtle test. Caleb's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move away. "You're not what I expected," Caleb said, his voice quieter now, almost curious. He sipped his beer, watching Ethan like he was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Ethan tilted his head, letting his hair fall into his eyes. "What did you expect? A scared kid begging for mercy?" Caleb's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. Something like that. Ethan laughed, low and warm, letting the sound linger. He was good at this, too good. He'd spent years perfecting the art of charm, using it to survive foster homes and street hustles. But Caleb was different. Every move Ethan made, Caleb countered, like a chess player who saw 3 steps ahead. Yet there was something in Caleb's gaze, a flicker of hunger that made Ethan's skin prickle. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You don't have to take me back to Marrow. You know, we could work something out." The words were laced with suggestion, but Ethan's heart pounded with the risk. If Caleb called his bluff, he was done for. Caleb's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Ethan thought he'd pushed too far. But then Caleb leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "You think you can play me, Kane? I've hunted men smarter than you." Ethan's breath caught, but he held Caleb's gaze, refusing to back down. "Maybe," he said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "But I'm not like the others." The air between them crackled, charged with something neither could name. Ethan's plan was working, but it was unraveling him too. He was supposed to be in control, but Caleb's presence, his intensity, his heat was pulling him under. As the night wore on, Ethan spun a story, mixing truth with lies. He told Caleb about his childhood, about the foster homes that taught him to trust no one, about the coding job that led him to Marrow's dark secrets. He left out the part about the stolen data, but he let his voice tremble, let his eyes shine with just enough vulnerability to make Caleb listen. Caleb didn't interrupt, but his gaze never wavered. When Ethan finished, Caleb leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You're good," he said finally, "but I don't buy it. Not all of it." Ethan's stomach dropped, but he kept his smile in place. "You don't have to buy it," he said, standing and tossing a few bills on the table. "Just think about it." He walked out, knowing Caleb would follow. The hunter always followed. But as Ethan stepped into the rain-soaked night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one being hunted now, not by Caleb's gun, but by something far more dangerous. The Seattle skyline glittered beyond the grimy window of Ethan's motel room, a cheap hideout on the edge of the city. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying the bar. The way Caleb's eyes had lingered on him. The way his own heart had betrayed him with a flutter he couldn't afford. Seduction was supposed to be his shield, but it was starting to feel like a noose. Caleb had followed him. Of course. Ethan had felt those blue eyes tracking him through the rain. A predator's gaze that never faltered. Now, as dawn broke, Ethan stood at the window, gripping the USB drive in his pocket, the evidence that could ruin Marrow. He'd copied it to a dozen hidden locations. A failsafe if Caleb dragged him back. But the weight of it felt heavier today, as if it carried more than just data. A knock at the door jolted him. Ethan's hand went to the knife tucked in his boot, a habit from years on the streets. He opened the door a crack, and there was Caleb, leaning against the frame, his hoodie damp from the morning mist. "You didn't run," Caleb said, his voice flat but his eyes searching. Ethan forced a smirk, stepping aside to let him in. "Told you. I'm done running." He closed the door, the click loud in the quiet room. The air was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. Caleb scanned the room, his movements precise, like he was cataloging every detail. "You're either brave or stupid, Kane." "Call it optimistic," Ethan shot back, sitting on the edge of the bed, letting his posture relax, inviting Caleb's gaze. He was playing the part, but his pulse raced. Caleb was too close, too real, his presence filling the small room like oxygen before a fire. Caleb didn't sit. He stood, arms crossed, his eyes narrowing. "What's your game, Ethan? You think you can flirt your way out of this?" Ethan's laugh was soft, almost genuine. "Is it working?" He tilted his head, letting his hair fall into his eyes. A move he knew was disarming. But Caleb's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened, like he was fighting something inside himself. "You're trouble," Caleb said, stepping closer, his voice low. "And I don't trust trouble." Ethan's breath hitched, but he leaned forward, closing the gap. "Maybe you should." His voice was a whisper, daring Caleb to cross the line. For a moment, they were inches apart, the air between them electric. Ethan could feel the heat of Caleb's breath, could see the conflict in his Aisa hunter torn between duty and something else. Then Caleb stepped back, breaking the spell. "Tell me why Marrow wants you so bad," he said, his tone all business now. "And don't lie this time." Ethan's stomach twisted. He'd expected this. But the truth was a tightrope. He decided to give Caleb just enough to keep him hooked. "I worked for him," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Found something I wasn't supposed to. Data. Experiments. People got hurt." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What kind of experiments?" Ethan hesitated, then leaned back, letting his shirt ride up slightly, exposing a sliver of skin. Another calculated move, but his heart wasn't in it this time. "The kind that'd make your skin crawl," he said softly. "I took proof. That's why he wants me dead." Caleb's jaw clenched, and for the first time, Ethan saw a crack in his stoic facade. Anger. Maybe. Or something deeper. "You're saying you're the good guy here?" Ethan laughed, bitter. "I'm not a good guy, Caleb. I'm just trying to survive." The room fell silent. the weight of his words hanging between them. Caleb's gaze softened. Just for a moment. And Ethan felt that spark again. The one that made his plan feel like a betrayal. He was supposed to be manipulating Caleb, not falling for him. Caleb moved to the window, staring out at the city. "If you're telling the truth, you're in deeper than you know," he said, his voice low. "Marrow doesn't just kill. He erases." Ethan's blood ran cold. He'd known Marrow was dangerous, but Caleb's words carried a weight that made it real. "Then help me," Ethan said, standing, his voice raw. "You don't have to be his dog." Caleb turned, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. "You don't know me," he said, but there was no venom in it. Just a quiet intensity that made Ethan's chest ache. "I could," Ethan replied, stepping closer, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know if he was playing the game or speaking the truth anymore. Caleb's hand twitched, like he wanted to reach out, but he didn't. Instead, he turned for the door. "Get some sleep," he said. "We're not done." As the door closed behind him, Ethan sank onto the bed, his heart pounding. He'd bought another day. Maybe, but at what cost? The line between survival and desire was blurring, and he wasn't sure he could walk it much longer. The next few days were a dangerous dance. Ethan stayed in the motel, knowing Caleb was watching, waiting for him to slip up. He left the curtains open. Let Caleb see him moving through the room. Let him think he was in control. But every glance, every calculated touch, was a step closer to a line Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to cross. Caleb came by every night, always unannounced, always with that same guarded intensity. They talked about nothing, about everything. Ethan shared half-truths about his past, leaving out the USB drive but letting Caleb see the scars, figurative and literal, that shaped him. Caleb, in turn, let slip fragments of his own Lithia childhood in rural Oregon. A stint in the military that left him hardened. A sister he hadn't seen in years. Each confession was a crack in the wall between them, and Ethan felt it crumbling. One night, as rain lashed the motel window, Caleb showed up with a cut above his eyebrow, blood trickling down his temple. Ethan's heart lurched, but he played it cool, grabbing a towel and pressing it to Caleb's face. "What happened?" he asked, his voice softer than he meant it to be. Caleb flinched but didn't pull away. "Marrow's men," he said, his voice tight. "They're getting impatient." Ethan's stomach dropped. He'd known Marrow wouldn't wait forever. But the thought of Caleb caught in the crossfire hit harder than expected. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said, his hand lingering on Caleb's cheek, the towel forgotten. Caleb's eyes met his, raw and unguarded. "You think I have a choice?" Ethan's breath caught. He wanted to push, to ask what held Caleb to Marrow. But the moment was too fragile. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "You could walk away." Caleb's hand shot out, grabbing Ethan's wrist. Not hard but firm. "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "Don't make this harder than it is." But Ethan didn't pull back. He stepped closer, his chest brushing Caleb's, his heart racing. "Maybe I want it to be hard," he said, his voice trembling with truth he hadn't meant to reveal. Caleb's grip tightened, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might kiss him. The air was thick, charged with unspoken need. But then Caleb let go, stepping back. His expression shuddered. "You're dangerous," he muttered, turning for the door. Ethan watched him go, his chest tight. He was supposed to be the one in control. But every encounter left him unraveling. He sank onto the bed, the USB drive burning a hole in his pocket. He needed a plan. A real one. Not this game of seduction that was starting to feel too real. The next morning, Ethan slipped out before dawn, leaving a note for Caleb, "Meet me at Pike Place. Noon." He needed neutral ground. A place where he could think without Caleb's presence clouding his judgment. The market was crowded. A chaos of vendors and tourists. The perfect place to blend in. Ethan stood by a fish stall, watching the crowd, his heart pounding as he waited. Caleb arrived right on time, his hoodie traded for a dark jacket, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Ethan. He crossed the market with purpose, his expression unreadable. "This better be good," he said, stopping a foot away. Ethan forced a smile, but his voice was serious. "I need you to trust me," he said. "Just for today." Caleb's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. They walked through the market, the noise and color a stark contrast to the tension between them. Ethan led him to a quiet corner, away from the crowds, and pulled out a burner phone. "I'm going to send the data to someone who can use it," he said. "But I need your help." Caleb's jaw tightened. "You're asking me to betray Marrow." "I'm asking you to do what's right," Ethan said, his voice raw. He stepped closer, his hand brushing Caleb's. "Please." For a moment, Caleb didn't move. Then he nodded. Just once. And Ethan felt a surge of hope and something deeper. Something he wasn't ready to name. The plan was simple but reckless. Ethan had a contact. A journalist named Mia who'd been digging into Marrow's empire for years. She'd agreed to meet them at a warehouse on the outskirts of Seattle. A place where they could transfer the data without prying eyes. But Ethan knew the risks Marrow's reach was long. And Caleb's involvement was a gamble. They drove in silence. Caleb behind the wheel of a beat-up truck, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Ethan stole glances at him, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. Caleb didn't look at him. "This isn't my first rodeo," he said, but his voice was strained. Ethan wanted to push, to ask what was eating at him, but he didn't. Instead, he reached out, his hand resting on Caleb's arm. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. Caleb's eyes flicked to him, then back to the road. "Don't thank me yet." The warehouse was a hulking shadow against the gray sky, its windows boarded up, its walls tagged with graffiti. Mia was waiting inside, a wiry woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She took one look at Caleb and raised an eyebrow. "You trust him?" she asked Ethan. Ethan hesitated, his eyes meeting Caleb's. "Yeah," he said finally, hoping he wasn't wrong. They transferred the data quickly, Mia's laptop humming as the files copied. Ethan explained what he'd found proof of Marrow's experiments. Names of victims. Locations of hidden labs. Mia's face grew grim, but her eyes lit up with determination. "This could bring him down," she said. But you're both in danger now. Caleb's expression didn't change, but Ethan saw his hand twitch, like he was ready to bolt. We'll handle it, Caleb said, his voice steady. As they left the warehouse, Ethan felt a weight lift, but it was replaced by a new one. He dragged Caleb into this, and now they were both targets. The drive back was tense, the silence heavier than before. When they reached the motel, Caleb killed the engine but didn't get out. Why'd you do it? Caleb asked, his voice low. Why risk everything? Ethan looked at him, his heart pounding. Because someone has to, he said. And because I think you're more than just Marrow's hunter. Caleb's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Ethan thought he'd leave. But then Caleb leaned across the seat, his hand cupping Ethan's face, his thumb brushing his cheek. You're gonna get us both killed, he murmured. But there was no anger in it, only a raw, aching need. Ethan's breath caught, and before he could think, he closed the distance, kissing Caleb with a desperation that surprised them both. The kiss was fierce, all heat and hunger, a collision of everything they'd been holding back. Caleb's hands tangled in Ethan's hair, pulling him closer, and for a moment, the world disappeared. When they pulled apart, panting, Caleb's eyes were wild. This doesn't change anything, he said, but his voice was unsteady. Ethan smiled, his heart racing. It changes everything. They didn't speak as they went inside, but the air between them was different now, charged with a new kind of danger. Ethan knew he was in too deep, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Caleb's touch still burned on his skin. The next week was a blur of stolen moments and mounting fear. Ethan and Caleb moved to a new hideout, a rundown apartment in Tacoma, hoping to stay one step ahead of Marrow's men. They were allies now, bound by the data they'd shared. But the kiss lingered between them, a question neither dared to answer. Ethan tried to focus on the plan, stay hidden. Wait for Mia to publish the story. Pray it was enough to cripple Marrow. But Caleb's presence was a distraction, his every move pulling Ethan's attention. The way he cleaned his gun with precise, deliberate motions. The way he laughed, rare and rough, when Ethan teased him. The way his eyes softened when he thought Ethan wasn't looking. One night, as they sat on the apartment's sagging couch, Caleb broke the silence. Why me? He asked, his voice quiet. Why trust me with this? Ethan looked at him, his heart twisting. Because I saw something in you, he said. Something good. Caleb's laugh was bitter. You're wrong about me, Ethan. I've done things, he trailed off, his eyes distant. Ethan reached out, his hand resting on Caleb's knee. We've all done things, he said softly. Doesn't mean that's all we are. Caleb's eyes met his, and for a moment, the walls were gone. He leaned in, kissing Ethan with a tenderness that broke something inside him. This wasn't the fierce hunger of before. This was something deeper, something that scared Ethan more than Marrow's men. They fell into a rhythm, a fragile balance of planning and passion. By day, they tracked Marrow's movements, using burner phones and encrypted messages to stay in touch with Mia. By night, they lost themselves in each other, their touches desperate, as if they could outrun the danger closing in. But danger always finds a way. One morning, Ethan woke to find Caleb gone. A note on the table. Stay put. I'll be back. Panic clawed at him, but he forced it down, grabbing his knife and checking the windows. The street below was too quiet. Caleb returned an hour later, his face grim. "Marrow knows," he said. "He's coming for us." Ethan's blood ran cold. "How?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Someone tipped him off. Mia's in hiding, but she's safe. For now." Ethan's mind raced. They needed to move. But where? Every safe house was compromised. Every ally a risk. He looked at Caleb, seeing the weight of his own choices reflected in those blue eyes. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb stepped closer, his hand cupping Ethan's face. "We fight," he said. "Together." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He'd started this to survive. But now it was about more than that. It was about Caleb. About the life they could have if they made it out. For the first time, he let himself believe in that possibility, even as fear gnawed at his edges. The fight came sooner than they expected. 2 days later, as they planned their next move, the apartment door splintered under a heavy boot. Ethan's heart stopped as 3 men burst in, guns drawn, their faces hard with purpose. Marrow's men. Caleb moved first, tackling the nearest one, his movements a blur of trained precision. Ethan dove for his knife, slashing at the second man's arm, earning a grunt of pain. The third aimed at Caleb, but Ethan threw himself forward, knocking the gun aside. The room erupted in chaos grunts, crashes, the sharp crack of a gunshot that grazed Ethan's shoulder, burning like fire. Caleb fought like a machine, but there was fear in his eyes, fear for Ethan. When the last man fell, Caleb grabbed Ethan, his hands shaking as he checked the wound. "You're okay," he said, more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan nodded, wincing. "We need to go." They fled into the night, stealing a car and driving north, toward the Canadian border. Ethan's shoulder throbbed, but he ignored it, focusing on Caleb's profile, lit by the dashboard's glow. "You saved me," Ethan said, his voice soft. Caleb's hands tightened on the wheel. "Don't get used to it." But Ethan saw the truth in his eyes, the same truth he felt in his own chest. They were in this together now. No turning back. They stopped at a gas station at dawn, the world quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Caleb cleaned Ethan's wound, his touch gentle but sure. "You're a mess," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Ethan laughed, wincing. "You're one to talk." Caleb's smile faded, and he leaned in, kissing Ethan softly, like he was afraid he'd break. "I can't lose you," he whispered, the words raw, unguarded. Ethan's heart swelled, but fear lingered. "You won't," he said, hoping it was true. They drove on, the border their only hope. But as they neared it, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, closing fast. Ethan's stomach dropped. "They found us." Caleb's jaw clenched. "Hold on." The chase was relentless, a high-speed blur through winding roads. Caleb drove like a man possessed, but the pursuers were too close. Ethan clutched the USB drive, knowing it was their only leverage. "We need to get this to Mia," he said, his voice steady despite the fear. Caleb nodded, his eyes on the road. "We will. Promise." The words were a lifeline, and Ethan clung to them as the headlights grew closer, the hunter becoming the hunted. The border was a faint hope on the horizon when the first bullet shattered the rear windshield. Ethan ducked, his heart pounding as Caleb swerved, tires screeching. "Stay down," Caleb shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. Ethan clutched the USB drive, his mind racing. They couldn't outrun Merrow's men forever. He glanced at Caleb, seeing the determination in his eyes, the way he fought for them both. "We need a plan," Ethan said, his voice trembling. Caleb's eyes flicked to him, then back to the road. "I'm working on it." The chase led them to a narrow bridge, the only way across a rushing river. Caleb slammed the brakes, spinning the car to block the road. "Get out," he said, grabbing his gun. Ethan hesitated, fear clawing at him. "Caleb, go." Caleb snapped, but his eyes softened. "I'll hold them off. Get to the border. Find Mia." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to stay, but he knew Caleb was right. He grabbed the USB drive and ran, his shoulder screaming with pain. Behind him, gunshots rang out, and he forced himself not to look back, not to think about Caleb facing those men alone. He reached the border on foot, his lungs burning, his heart heavy. Mia was waiting, hidden in a safe house just across the line. She took the drive, her face grim. "This better be worth it," she said. "It is," Ethan said, but his thoughts were on Caleb. He'd left him behind, and the guilt was a knife in his gut. Hours later, Mia's story broke, a bombshell that exposed Merrow's empire to the world. Social media exploded, hashtags trending, news outlets scrambling. Ethan watched it unfold from the safe house, his heart in his throat. But there was no word from Caleb. He waited, pacing, his mind replaying every moment: the bar, the kiss, the way Caleb's hands felt on his skin. He'd started this to survive, but somewhere along the way, he'd fallen for the hunter who was supposed to destroy him. As dawn broke, a knock at the door made Ethan freeze. He grabbed a knife, his heart pounding, and opened it to find Caleb, bloodied but alive, his blue eyes bright with relief. "You made it," Caleb said, his voice rough. Ethan threw his arms around him, tears stinging his eyes. "You idiot," he choked out. "I thought I lost you." Caleb's arms tightened around him, his breath warm against Ethan's neck. Not a chance. They held each other, the world fading away. Merrow's empire was crumbling. But in that moment, all that mattered was the man in Ethan's arms. The aftermath was chaos, but Ethan and Caleb were free. Merrow's empire collapsed under the weight of Mia's expose, his assets frozen, his name a curse on every news channel. The hunter had become the hunted, and Ethan's stolen data was the weapon that brought him down. They stayed in Canada, laying low in a small coastal town, far from Seattle's shadows. The safe house was a weathered cabin by the sea, its walls creaking with every gust of wind. Ethan's shoulder healed slowly, but the deeper wounds, the fear, The guilt took longer. Caleb was there through it all, his presence a steady anchor. One evening, as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the waves crash under a bruised sky, Caleb spoke. "I was supposed to end you," he said, his voice quiet. "But you ended me." Ethan looked at him, his heart swelling. "You're still here," he said, reaching for Caleb's hand. Caleb's fingers laced with his, strong and sure. "Because of you." They kissed, slow and deep, the ocean's roar drowning out the world. Ethan had started this with a plan to survive, using seduction as a shield. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost his heart to the man who was supposed to be his enemy. Their love wasn't easy. It was forged in danger, tempered by trust. But as they built a life together, away from the shadows, Ethan knew it was worth every risk. They were no longer hunter and prey, but partners, bound by a love that had defied the odds. The USB drive was gone, the secrets exposed. But Ethan carried something Newa hoped he'd never known, a future he hadn't dared to dream. And as he looked at Caleb, his blue eyes reflecting the sea, Ethan knew he'd found something worth fighting for. In the end, survival wasn't about outrunning the hunter. It was about finding the courage to stop running, to face the danger, and to love despite it all.